On the morning the empire died, she was only a child. She stood on the edge of a broken city and watched her husband dragged through red water. The lake smelled of death. The sky was quiet. And the world she was born into was ending. She did not know yet that this was only the beginning. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not end with swords. It ended with women. And what happened to them after the siege was not written in school books. It was recorded in property lists, in marriage contracts, in baptism records, in wills, and in silence. This is the story of what happened after the city fell. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. August 13th, 1521. The siege had lasted 93 days. 93 days of hunger. 93 days of disease. 93 days of watching the strongest warriors fall and never rise again. Tenochtitlan was once the brightest city in the Americas. It stood in the middle of a shining lake. White temples rose into the sky. Markets filled with color and sound. More than 200,000 people lived inside its walls. It was larger than any city in Spain. Now it was rubble. The causeways were broken. The canals were clogged with bodies. The water that once carried flowers now carried the dead. Tuikpo stood near the shore. She was no more than 12 years old. She had already been married 3 times. Her first husband had been killed during the massacre at the Great Temple. Her second husband, her own uncle, ruled for only 80 days before smallpox took him. Smallpox came before the final battle. It killed nobles. It killed priests. It killed generals. It killed children. It softened the empire before the sword ever touched it. Now her third husband, the last emperor, was being pulled from a canoe. He was only 25. He was exhausted, thin, hungry, but still proud. Spanish soldiers forced him to his knees. In front of Hernan Cortés. The empire was no longer an empire. It was a lesson meant to be seen. A dead emperor can become a symbol. A living emperor forced to kneel becomes a warning. Tuikpo watched. She did not scream. There was no strength left in the city for screaming. Behind her, women searched through broken stones for food. Some had been eating leather. Some had been eating insects. Mothers held babies too weak to cry. There were no priests left to pray. No warriors left to fight. Only survivors. And survivors are useful. That is what the Spanish understood. The siege was not only about destroying buildings. It was about breaking structure, breaking law, breaking memory, breaking bloodlines. The men died in battle. The women lived. And because they lived, they became valuable. Not as people, but as bridges. Tuikpo did not know it yet, but her life would no longer belong to her. It would belong to a system that did not need chains. It had paperwork. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not end with fire. It began with marriage contracts. And the daughter of the emperor was about to become the most important piece on the board. When the city finally fell, the killing did not stop. It changed. The smoke cleared. The temples were broken. The banners were gone. But the work of conquest was only beginning. Spanish soldiers moved through the ruins of Tenochtitlan like men walking through a market. They were not searching for food. They were not searching for gold. They were searching for women. Not randomly. Not wildly. Systematically. Officers were given noblewomen. Common soldiers were given commoners. Rank determined reward. Women were listed beside weapons, land, and treasure. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortez's own men, later described this as something normal. Routine. Expected. He wrote about feeling sorry when some soldiers were too cruel, but he never questioned the system itself. That tells you everything. The taking of women was not chaos. It was policy without a written law. It was understood. Tuikpo was not taken by a random soldier. She was too important for that. She was the daughter of Moctezuma II. Her blood carried power. Her name carried legitimacy. The Spanish understood something very quickly. A dead empire can still rule, if you marry it. So they did not kill all the noble daughters. They secured them, guarded them, assigned protection to them. Not because they cared, because they calculated. 300 indigenous warriors and 30 Spanish soldiers were assigned to guard the royal girls during the retreat known as La Noche Triste. Not refugees, assets. After the final surrender, the Spanish gathered the surviving noblewomen. Some were still children. Some were widows. Some had watched their husbands die in front of them. They were baptized, renamed, redistributed. Tuikpo became Isabel. Her sister became Leonor. Names that once carried dates from the sacred calendar were replaced with the names of Catholic saints. One ceremony, a splash of water, a new identity. The old gods were not debated. They were erased. The Spanish did not need to understand Nahuatl. They needed the women to understand obedience. Marriage followed baptism. Isabel was married to a Spanish officer, then widowed, then married again, and again. 6 marriages in her life. 3 Aztec, 3 Spanish. She chose none of the Spanish ones. Each marriage was not about love. It was about land, about tribute, about legal transfer. Because under Spanish law, a married woman's property belonged to her husband. Under Aztec law, noblewomen could own property. They could initiate divorce. They could appear in court. Under Spanish colonial law, those rights disappeared. 1 baptism, 1 marriage, and a woman became a bridge between 2 worlds. But the bridge only went one way. Through her body, land moved. Through her children, titles moved. Through her silence, the empire was absorbed. This was not simple cruelty. This was engineering. The Spanish did not only conquer Tenochtitlan with steel. They rebuilt it through wombs. Every noble daughter married to a conquistador created a child who could claim both Spanish authority and Aztec heritage. That child would rank higher than his own mother. He would inherit. She would disappear. This was the machine. It did not shout. It filed documents. And it worked. The war was over. But power does not disappear. It changes shape. Hernan Cortés understood something that many conquerors before him did not. Force is expensive. Armies must be fed. Soldiers must be paid. Rebellions must be crushed again and again. But marriage? Marriage is quiet. Marriage makes conquest look legal. Isabel, once called Tuikpo, was now living in a Spanish house. The city around her was no longer Tenochtitlan. It was becoming Mexico City. The temples were being torn apart stone by stone. Those same stones were used to build churches. The gods were not debated. They were dismantled. And Isabel was part of the reconstruction. In 1526, Cortés arranged her marriage to Alonso de Grado, a Spanish official in charge of collecting indigenous tribute. This was not romance. This was strategy. Along with Isabel came land. The encomienda of Tacuba. Thousands of indigenous people were assigned to this land. Their labor, their crops, their tribute, all of it flowed through the legal husband of Isabel. Do you see it? The Spanish did not steal the land openly. They married into it. Alonso de Grado did not rule because he conquered. He ruled because he married. And that marriage carried the blood of the Aztec emperor. The illusion was powerful. It said, "This is not theft. This is inheritance." But inheritance built on a broken city is still theft. Alonso de Grado died 2 years later. Isabel was widowed again. But Cortés did not let her remain unmarried for long. Because an unmarried noblewoman was dangerous. She carried independent legitimacy. She could be claimed by someone else. So Cortés made a decision. He took her as his own. Quietly, without ceremony, without public marriage. She became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter, Leonor, the child of the man who destroyed her father's empire. The child of the man who watched her husband kneel. When the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, Cortés quickly arranged another marriage for her. Pedro Gallego de Andrade, another Spanish soldier, another legal transfer. Isabel moved again, not because she wanted to, because the system required it. Pedro died within a year. And then came Juan Cono de Saavedra, her final husband. With him, she would remain until her death. But even then, her life was not peaceful. She spent years fighting in Spanish courts, arguing, petitioning, demanding back payments of tribute, defending Tacuba from officials who tried to seize it. Imagine it, the daughter of an emperor, standing in a foreign courtroom, speaking in a language that was not hers, using laws that had erased her world, begging to keep what was already hers. This was the new battlefield. No swords, no shields, only paperwork. The empire had fallen, but its blood still mattered. And through Isabel's marriages, that blood entered Spanish nobility. Her children were raised as Spaniards. They spoke Spanish. They prayed in Spanish. They married Spaniards. Each generation moved further from the lake, further from the old temples, further from the language of their mother. The system did not need to burn books. It simply changed mothers into vessels. The conquest did not reproduce itself through war. It reproduced itself through birth. And Isabel was both victim and foundation. The city was rebuilt. The churches rose. The markets reopened. But under every new building was a memory. And inside every marriage contract was a quiet surrender. Isabel's name survived. Her land survived. Her children entered the records of Spanish nobility. But most women were not Isabel. Most women were never written down. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish kept careful lists. They counted gold. They counted land. They counted tribute. They counted cattle. They did not count women. Yet women were everywhere in the system. They carried it. They fed it. They suffered under it. When the siege ended, thousands of women walked out of the ruins. They had lost fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Smallpox had already killed many men before the final attack. War finished the rest. Entire noble families were erased in months. What remained were widows and girls. The Spanish created the encomienda system. On paper, it did not call people slaves. It said indigenous communities were protected in exchange for labor and tribute. In reality, it meant this: they could not leave. They could not refuse. They could not resist without punishment. Men were sent to mines, to fields, to construction sites. Many never returned. So women became the center of survival. They planted the crops. They harvested the food. They raised children alone. They produced extra goods to meet tribute demands. If tribute was not paid, punishment followed. Whippings, confiscations, violence. The system did not need chains. It had hunger, and hunger is stronger than iron. In Spanish households, indigenous women were assigned as domestic servants. Records used a simple phrase: all obligations. That meant everything: cooking, cleaning, carrying water, grinding maize, washing clothes, and whatever else was demanded. There were no fixed hours, no wages that could truly protect them. They were not officially slaves, but they were not free. They lived in a space between the two, a dangerous space, because when someone is called a slave, at least the law names the condition. When someone is called free but has no freedom, the law disappears. That gap was where the worst abuse happened. Women were expected to serve without complaint. If they resisted, they could be beaten. If they ran, they could be hunted. If they became pregnant by Spanish men, their children entered the new racial system, the casta system. At the top were Spaniards born in Spain. Below them, Spaniards born in the colonies. Then children of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers. Then others mixed with African blood. At the bottom were indigenous and enslaved Africans. A child born from an indigenous woman and a Spanish man ranked higher than his own mother. He could own property under Spanish law. She often could not. Every birth moved the next generation further from her world. The conquest did not only destroy a city, it reorganized blood. And across New Spain, thousands of women lived this quiet transformation. They did not stand in front of emperors. They did not appear in royal courts. They did not leave wills. They left children. And those children carried two histories inside them. One history was allowed to grow. The other was slowly silenced. The Spanish wrote reports about mines and silver shipments. They did not write about mothers who worked until their milk dried up. They did not record how many women miscarried from carrying loads too heavy. They did not document how many newborns died because their mothers were too exhausted to feed them. The numbers that survived tell us populations fell from millions to a fraction within 80 years. Disease played a role. War played a role. But forced labor and endless tribute made survival almost impossible. And still, the women endured. They worked markets. They sold food. They moved to cities when villages could no longer support life. By the 1600s, in many colonial cities, most market vendors were indigenous women. They stood in public spaces, selling goods in the shadow of churches built from the stones of their temples. Their names had changed. Their clothing had changed. Their gods were forbidden. But they were still there, uncounted, unprotected, necessary. The empire ran on their labor, and the records called it civilization. Before the city fell, before the marriages, before the paperwork, there was another woman. Her name at birth may have been Malinali. The Spanish called her Dona Marina. History remembers her as La Malinche. She was not born into Spanish power. She was born into an indigenous noble family. But when her father died, everything changed. Her mother remarried. A new son was born. And suddenly, Malinali was in the way. So she was sold. Sold as a child. Sold into slavery. Passed from one group to another. Traded like an object. Long before she ever met a Spaniard. When Hernan Cortés arrived on the coast in 1519, 20 women were given to him as tribute after a battle. Malinali was one of them. She spoke Nahuatl. She also spoke another local language. Cortés had a Spanish priest who spoke Maya. Together, the chain of translation began. Maya to Spanish, Nahuatl to Maya. Malinali became the bridge. Soon she learned Spanish too. And then the chain was no longer needed. She stood beside Cortés in every meeting, every negotiation, every warning, every threat. Aztec leaders began addressing Cortés through her. Some even called him by her name, as if he were an extension of her voice. Think about that. An enslaved teenage girl became the voice of conquest. But voice is not power. She advised. She translated. She bore a son by Cortés. Motín. one of the first children born from Spanish father and indigenous mother in Mexico, a symbol of the new world forming. When Cortés no longer needed her at his side, he married her off to one of his officers. Like Isabel, like many others, transferred, reassigned, useful, and then distant. Over time, her name became something else. In Mexico, the word Malinchista came to mean someone who betrays their own people. Murals painted her as a serpent. Stories blamed her for the fall of an empire. But ask yourself this: what choice did she have? She was sold as a child, given as tribute, placed between armies. Refusal would not have saved her people. Refusal would have killed her. History often looks for a single face to blame. It is easier to accuse one woman than to confront a system. Malinali did not command Spanish cannons. She did not unleash smallpox. She did not design the encomienda. She translated. She survived. And survival inside conquest can look like betrayal from the outside. Her story and Isabel's story are different, but they meet in the same truth. The conquest needed women, not only for marriage, not only for birth, but for legitimacy, for language, for stability. Without Malinali, Cortés would have struggled to form alliances. Without Isabel and the noble daughters, Spanish control would have rested only on violence. The system was built on women's bodies and women's voices. Then history blamed them for it. Malinali disappears from the record around 1529. Some believe she died young, in her 20s. There is no grand tomb, no palace, no public statue from her own time, only memory and accusation. For 500 years, she carried the weight of a nation's anger. While the men who built the machine are often remembered as explorers, heroes, founders, the pattern is clear. When empires fall, women are blamed. When empires rise, women are used. And when history is written, women are simplified. Traitor, concubine, wife, mother, but never strategist, never survivor, never trapped. Malinali did not end the Aztec world. The machine did. And she, like Isabel, was caught inside it. One translated its rise. The other was married into its foundation. Both survived. And survival, in a conquered land, is never simple. Isabel was 41 years old when she knew her life was ending. She had lived through the fall of an empire. She had watched her husband dragged through red water. She had been baptized into a faith she did not choose. She had been married 6 times. She had carried children for men who replaced her world with their own. Now she lay in a Spanish house, in a Spanish city, built on the bones of Tenochtitlan. And she began to dictate her will. Not in Nahuatl, in Spanish, the language of the conquerors, the language of courts and contracts, the language that had erased her name. The will was recorded carefully, witnessed by Spanish officials, filed in colonial archives. This is the only place where her voice survives clearly, not as someone's wife, not as someone's daughter, but as herself. She freed every enslaved person she owned. Every one. Think about that. She had grown up watching her people forced into labor, watching tribute demanded from broken villages, watching women assigned to Spanish households under the phrase all obligations. And at the end of her life, she did one thing the system did not expect. She released her own hold over others. It was a small act in a vast machine, but it was hers. She also set aside part of her estate for Leonor, the daughter she bore to Hernan Cortés. For years, Isabel had refused to publicly recognize that child. Silence was her only shield. Silence was her only protest. Now, in her final days, she gave Leonor a portion of her inheritance. Not everything, but something. Was it forgiveness? Was it duty? We do not know. The records do not describe her emotions. They only record property. But even through paperwork, you can feel the weight of that decision. She left land to her children by Juan Cono. Children raised as Spanish Catholics. Children who spoke Spanish. Children who married into Spanish families. Her blood would enter European nobility. Her grandchildren would hold titles. Her descendants would stand in Spanish courts not as subjects, but as aristocrats. And centuries later, Spain would pay a pension to her descendants because they were legally recognized as heirs to Moctezuma's throne. The throne Spain had destroyed. There is a strange irony in that. The system absorbed her family, then had to acknowledge it. But acknowledgement is not restoration. It does not rebuild temples. It does not return language. It does not revive the dead. Mexico City today stands where Tenochtitlan once stood. The Metropolitan Cathedral rises over the old sacred center. Stones from the destroyed temple are inside its walls. Tourists walk across the main plaza. They take pictures. They drink coffee. Beneath their feet are the remains of a civilization that once ruled millions. And beneath that history are women whose names are missing. Isabel's name survived because she was useful, because she married strategically, because she fought in courts. But thousands of others left no will, no land, no recorded voice. They carried children. They carried water. They carried grief. The population of central Mexico fell from around 22 million in 1519 to less than 3 million by the end of the century. Disease killed many. War killed many. Forced labor killed many. But the system that followed made sure that survival came with transformation. Names changed. Clothing changed. Faith changed. Language faded. The old calendar disappeared. The new calendar replaced it. Generations grew up speaking Spanish, praying in Spanish, thinking in Spanish. But blood does not forget easily. Today, most Mexicans carry indigenous ancestry. The records may have erased names, but the body remembers. Isabel began life as Tuikpo, cotton flower, a child standing by a red lake. She ended life as Dona Isabel Moctezuma, a Spanish noblewoman, writing a will in a language that once invaded her city. Between those two names is the story of what happened to Aztec noblewomen after the fall. They were not only conquered, they were converted into structure, into bridges, into foundations. The conquest did not end with fire. It continued through marriage, through birth, through law, through silence. And in the end, the empire did not just fall. It was absorbed. And the women who survived carried both worlds inside them. One world was allowed to rise. The other was forced to fade. But even faded things leave shadows. And sometimes, in quiet archives and buried stones, those shadows speak.